Thank you, Diane. Very nice of you. Thank you. Hi. Thank you so much for coming out, and thank you for this wonderful invitation by the University of Florida. It's a huge honor to be here. As Diane said, I started my environmental reporting 11 years ago in Florida at the Daytona Beach News Journal. And then 3 years ago, I published the book Stolen World, which you mentioned, which is a narrative of two guys who spent their entire adult lives smuggling rare species. And a lot of that book takes place in Florida as well. The year after Stolen World was published, so 2012, I picked up and moved to Latin America, partly because I got the sense that there were a lot of good wildlife and nature stories that were not being covered, or were not being covered very well in English. And so I've been living there ever since, most recently in El Salvador, trying, and I do say trying, because it's, you know, it's a work in progress, but to establish myself as a magazine writer. And I've produced a couple of narratives that I'll tell you a little bit about. I also do a ton of book reviews for the Wall Street Journal and the Times Literary Supplement in London, and almost all of them are on wildlife and natural history topics. Latin America presents some really serious challenges for any reporter, but especially for a wildlife reporter, because it's Asian and protection. You have the same assaults that you have here in Florida. So you have development, resource extraction, agriculture, climate change, all of that. But then you add to that corruption, sometimes a total lack of transparency, and making it seem impossible to get information. And then in some countries, and I'll talk a little bit about this, you also have violence and drug trafficking in the same areas, you know, in the most pristine areas, really, which can really complicate the picture. We're going to talk about some of those complicated pictures. So yeah, I'd like to talk about how I learned to maneuver in this environment. We can call it the underworld, if we like. It's a process that began for me here in Florida, where I learned a lot about what I now know. So these are some old pieces from the News Journal. In 2003, I began working as an environmental reporter at the Daytona Beach News Journal. As we all know, Florida has a lot of protected ecosystems, a lot of endangered species, and many of them in commercially desirable areas. So the political clashes are incessant, and some of them have been going on for decades. So as a new writer in this environment, I tried to look for ways to write about these contested species. You know, these pieces I have up are actually, one of them is about common species, vultures, but that were either a little less polarizing in terms of politics, or just more intriguing for a reader to follow. So for example, with sea turtle protection, you had this enormous focus on beach driving, on the legislative aspects of it, the ramifications of endangered species laws on people's lives. And I felt that what marine turtles actually were, and what they did, had gone completely missing in all this coverage. So I tried to write pieces about turtles that had nothing whatsoever to do with politics. And I started out by writing a piece on marine turtles' sexual tendencies, you know, and I found some bizarre research from the Cayman Islands on turtle sex. And I don't think this research was ever really used. A sea turtle researcher, Peter Pritchard, actually just kind of handed it over to me. And I had a famous sea turtle investor showing me his bottles of turtle penises. I had a lot of marine turtle scientists sharing some pretty raunchy experiences with male sea turtles, trying to mount them and that sort of thing. So the point wasn't to try and avoid addressing the underlying conservation issues. It was to find a pathway into them that would be more enticing for a reader to follow. You know, and a lot of times when you had an ecological subject, I found that the pathway was a person, and I also had, I found that non-scientists could sometimes make the better pathway. So I remember in 2005 or 2006, I was writing about eels. There was concern that baby eels were not being recruited at the right rate into Florida waterways, and there was a concern that there may have been a climactic changing currents that was causing their failure to enter the estuaries in time. And you know, I suppose I could have framed the story around the scientists doing the project, but I decided to frame the story around, you know, the driver, this Dutch guy of this special eel truck that he must have invested, I don't know how much money in to transport live eels to market, and he could no longer fill the truck. So I was always looking not necessarily for the most authoritative voice, but the most compelling human story to wrap the biological story around. And I found it important then and now to remember that whenever you write about any endangered species, there's always a specific set of circumstances leading to that endangerment. And that set of circumstances can be recent and it can be, you know, in the fairly distant past. But I always found it important to describe exactly what caused the endangerment of a species, because there's nothing more numbing to a reader than to hear the endangered marine turtle, you know, over and over and over again. And I actually have a feeling that with a certain type of reader, they feel assaulted or accosted by that constant reference, as though I'm somehow blaming them for the endangerment of the species. So I would go to great lengths to try and express what was causing endangerment, and a lot of times, of course, you have to dig pretty deep to understand it. And the other thing I learned in Daytona was to be out in the field as much as physically possible, and to try and verify things with my own eyes, that there's just no substitute for getting out there. I'd probably written 25 articles about gopher tortoises, about mitigation, about, at the time it was legal to have an incidental take permit. You could bury a gopher tortoise. Before I actually snuck onto a property that was being developed, and the developer and the county environmental officials had assured me that everything was in perfect compliance with environmental regulations and that all precautions were being taken to protect this group of tortoises. You know, but once I snuck on the property, I found crushed tortoises actually everywhere. So I got a much more impactful, if you will, sense of what this actually involved. So, you know, over those years in Daytona, I really developed a lot of confidence in my own powers of observation that will go on to serve me pretty well in my next venture, which was Stolen World. So I don't know if anybody has a copy at home of the Conan Doyle book, The Lost World, the original, has a little footprint going across it. Well, both the title and the cover were sort of intended to play on that. In 2007, I quit the paper to write this book, on wildlife criminals, in particular people who smuggle reptiles for the exotic pet trade. Wildlife smuggling is a really taboo crime. I mean, I can only think of, you know, organ trafficking or like human trafficking as more scandalous. It's frequently compared with drug smuggling. You know, you hear constantly in the press of like a $10 billion trade in illegal animals, second only to the drug trade, blah, 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 blah. But there's almost no neutral reporting on the wildlife trade, because most of the information about it comes from NGOs or it comes from law enforcement. So what no one had really done with wildlife trafficking was ask, you know, who commits this sort of crime and why? And I wanted to know, what were the motives? Were they strictly financial? Or were there deeper human motives behind this? And the answers I found were really surprising. The main subject of my book were two American guys. One of them is, as the Bartletts know well, Tom Crutchfield, who, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of him. He's sort of an old-time Florida snake guy. He used to live quite close to here in Bushnell, and now he's down in South Florida. He pops up on TV now and then. He had the dubious honor recently of being the subject of a Locked Up Abroad episode. Let's see, that's Tom in about, I don't know, early 80s. And then that's me and Tom in the Everglades just probably 5 or 6 years ago. My other subject is Hank Molt. He was from Philadelphia, a bit older than Tom, a sort of cunning con man. Who really came to be the beating heart of this book. So I happened to meet them both. Well, that's Hank in the 60s, and that's him about 08. I happened to meet them both at a reptile expo in Orlando. I don't know how many of you have been exposed to the reptile pet trade, but Florida is home to a lot of legal wildlife or reptile breeders and importers, as well as, of course, a few, you know, committed illegal dealers. And these two were sort of among the older members of this sort of subculture. These were the guys everybody was always whispering about. These were the guys with something a little special. under their tables, and they seemed, from what I could tell, to have a relationship between the two of them. They'd been friends, and then they'd been mortal enemies. And when I say mortal enemies, I mean mortal enemies. I mean really bad. And then sort of acknowledged frenemies as the years wore on. Hank, my first subject, was pretty easy to get stories out of almost immediately. You know, in part because his stories involved his travels to collect illegal animals. You know, everybody kind of likes to recount travel adventures. Tommy had just come out of jail. He was more reluctant. He was working as a safari guide in Fort Myers in the Everglades, one of those airboat deals. So I took his Everglades safari one day in 2004, and that's how we came to be in contact. But so the real point of my book is that neither of these guys started out as criminals. Both of them were at one time relatively respected animal dealers to zoos and museums. And in the beginning of their careers, in the 1960s, in Hank's case, and probably a little later in Tom's, they enjoyed a certain level of prestige, or at least an acknowledgement in the scientific and zoological community. So Hank, for example, would go to Papua New Guinea on behalf of the Philadelphia Zoo, the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences. Tommy would collect new species when he could for a well-known herpetologist in Miami, you know, and would always be upset when nobody named a species after him. When nobody, I think he'll die without having a Crutchfieldi species. But they were comfortable in that world. They were comfortable having drinks with the zoo director. They maneuvered well in it. And then in the 1970s, you had a sea change in environmental wildlife, in international wildlife law and endangered species law. You had CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, passing in, I think it passed in 73 and was enacted in 75. And that made a lot of animal collecting and importing illegal and restricted it completely. So that affected everything from, you know, medical laboratories to the pet trade to, you know, to the skin trades. But these my two guys, continued to travel, and they continued to collect rare animals and sell them, often to the same places they'd been selling to before, which just brought them under the table. And we're talking about the period between about 1975 and 1980. And they kept this up until federal prosecutors started coming after them with a vengeance. They started coming after them, and they started coming after zoos in the 1980s for violation of the, you know, relatively new endangered species laws. And it was at that point that the scientific community and zoo community ruptured with these guys and shunned them. So they started selling to private collectors who were not subject to the scrutiny and the government oversight that the zoos were. And here are a couple price lists. This one is a Tom price list from, I think it looks like it's 88, and this is a Hank price list on a single frog, you know, who probably highly illegal, claims that it comes from a breeding program in Russia, but I think it came straight from Vietnam. But at any rate, the private sector became the driving sector in the animal trade. The zoo sector became less and less important. And these two guys became bitter, almost crazed personal rivals of some of the zoo curators who were once their customers and their friends. They've been kicked out of the scientific community, and they just never got over it. Hank went on to develop a pretty bad drinking problem. Tom was sort of violent and impulsive, you know, and what I was chronicling of their lives in Stolen World, you could probably describe as a slow, you know, downward spiral. And neither of them could stop traveling, neither of them could stop fantasizing about the places they would go, the animals they could catch, even after all the misery that it caused them and their families, and even when they were relatively, you know, when they were older. You know, and every once in a while I found a zoo curator acting somewhat like a smuggler. In the course of writing Stolen World, I conducted an investigation that actually took me to Holland and Madagascar to look into the theft of some extremely rare tortoises called plowshare tortoises from a breeding farm in Madagascar. A famous British zoo was breeding them as a hedge against their extinction because they were all but extinct. And you know, a few months later, the stolen tortoises appeared sort of out of the blue in Holland, And then they were secretly flown to the United States, to the Bronx Zoo. So in the course of my investigation in Holland and Madagascar, I collected some documents suggesting pretty strongly that the curator of reptiles at that time was highly interested in getting those tortoises, and that long before the theft, and that the British Zoo was highly interested in having them be transferred to the Bronx Zoo. But what stopped it was the government of Madagascar refused to issue the permit. So and then suddenly the animals were stolen, and then a few months later they ended up in New York. Then he was forced to actually return them. So the whole thing to me was incredible. I mean, I could never really link the Bronx Zoo, and I'm not even sure that there was such a direct link. But the Bronx Zoo was pretty famous for its conservation work in Madagascar, and the curator involved was a guy who had known my subjects since the 70s and despised them. And he testified or given statements against both of them in federal court, and was one of the loudest opponents of the illegal wildlife trade. So anyway, just to go back, and I hope you'll indulge me on this, I felt and I feel, that the tension between the specimen collectors in the field and the scientific professionals, the taxonomists in institutions, has actually probably been one of the dynamics of natural history for a long time. From the 19th century, the act of going and getting specimens, live or dead, generally was sort of outsourced to freelance collectors who were not scientists. And there was a whole blue-collar cottage industry around natural history museums. So we're talking about not only the collectors, but also taxidermists, all kinds of non-scientists who served these institutions, and they enjoyed some respect within the scientific community, of course, but there was always tension. When a new species was named, it would generally be at the discretion of the taxonomist, never or rarely, I would assume, the collector. But the collectors were the ones out in the field, and they were able, but they were able to notice some things about the animal's behavior and ecology that the taxonomists, viewing the dead specimens, probably couldn't. And I think they always felt somewhat slighted. I just think that bitter dynamic was always a part of it. So, my guys, I think my guys felt that they were some sort of the legacy of Alfred Russel Wallace or something. A co-discoverer of evolution who was, never given sufficient credit. And one of them even had a Wallace bumper sticker on his car. Hank Molt went to great lengths to seek out a place in Indonesia called the Wallace Line. So I think that they were cognizant of what they felt was their legacy. And I really did think that this bitterness that I was seeing was part of something a lot older. And it may even date back to, Linnaeus, who sent, I don't know, God knows how many of his students, out to collect for him. So anytime you outsource something like that, you're almost inviting a sort of tension or bitterness. At any rate, writing Stolen World was a really big adventure. I traveled to 10 countries to do it. Sometimes I followed my protagonists around as they did bad things, which was always dicey. And I did something a little unusual, and I guess or at least taboo as far as writing is concerned. I paid my main subject for his cooperation, or the way we formalized it, I paid him to borrow about 10 books of documents, and this was correspondence, receipts, photos, all kinds of stuff that without it, my narrative would have been based on hearsay. And to have it allowed me to piece together a solid chronology, and also gave me all kinds of new names and contacts with which to verify the facts of the story. So I had originally, what I was told, then I had what I had in the boxes, and then I could, start the long process of actually verifying this information and forming the backbone of a chronological narrative. And the other reason was I had a kind of rival for the story. There was another writer working on the same story about reptile smugglers, and he was getting closer and closer to my subjects. We really hated each other. And it was bad. I mean, when I would go to courthouses and dig up old records, sometimes I would see, the mark of like a rusty old paperclip on the documents, and I would see where he had replaced it with a new paperclip, and I thought, oh geez, I can't beat this guy. And I didn't beat him. He beat me. The book that he wrote was called The Lizard King, and it came out a little bit before my book. But I still feel that my book got the deeper story, really, and so I'm kind of proud of it. At any rate, yeah, I was glad I put the effort in, even if I'd lost the race. Some of the reviews of Stolen World that came out, and they were generally good, said that I'd gone undercover to expose the international reptile trade, but I never once lied about my identity or about what I was doing. You could maybe say that I infiltrated a little bit, and when I say infiltrated, I was just hanging around. I had the feeling that to get the good stuff, you really had to be there all the time, and I had the patience and the time. I was living in Florida. Most of these conventions were taking place in Florida, and the traders that I was writing about and their friends got used to me, and of course, people dropped their guard after a while, and they drank a lot, which always helps. So traveling with them was really rough. It could be really dicey. I had a trip to Africa that I'm amazed I survived. I had one trip with Tommy Crutchfield to the Dominican Republic where they were going around bagging snakes, and this had been a grand folly from the start. This trip, all kinds of things went wrong. So they were bagging these snakes that they had no business taking, and then they were talking about going to Haiti to export them. So I thought, and that would have been illegal. So I sort of discreetly changed my flight rather than, end up in a Haitian prison or something like that. But the more I knew of them and the more experiences we shared, the more they told me, when you really, really know your topic, you will get candid interviews, regardless of how initially reluctant a source may be. I even once went back to a hostile source, a man in Penang, Malaysia. His name is Anson Wong. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. Anson he had been in jail in the United States for a long time for trafficking, and he was sort of a really rough trafficker. I mean, he was this type of person who probably would have trafficked a panda. Probably did. So anyway, I went to him wanting to verify some things actually about his relationship with Tommy Crutchfield. And I knocked on his door based on a document that I found in Hank's boxes, like this onion skin stationery, a letter that he'd written. And I got in a cab in Penang, and we went to the shop, and he kicked me out. But I kept writing him, and I kept writing him with more and more details of what I wanted. And generally, when you approach somebody with a lot of detail, really well prepared, they will respond. So I went back to Penang more than a year later, and I knocked on his door again, and he gave me a very candid interview, and he paid for my hotel. He picked up my tab. So at any rate, all of this cost money, obviously, flying to 10 countries. At first, it was my own money before I sold it, and then it was the publishers, and until finally, there really wasn't a whole lot left. I was left waitressing in Flagler County, so I would write in the morning and then go serve hamburgers at night. But I'm really proud of the book that resulted. It was late. It was it didn't sell that well, but yeah, a couple of my subjects went a little crazy on me after it came out because they didn't like how they were portrayed. Tom Crutchfield hated the book, and he had his friends sort of launch a little campaign on Amazon to give me 1-star reviews on the day that it came out as a riot to read them. Now it was like a coordinated attack. Yeah, it was unpleasant for a little while. The Bronx Zoo didn't like it, but there wasn't much they could do about it, and Hank actually liked it. So even though he comes off looking as the biggest sociopath of all. So I do believe that this book is the only book to date to paint a really intimate picture of wildlife traffickers. I've written a bit about drug traffickers as well. Last fall I published a long story. It sold as a Kindle single on Griselda Blanco, who was a famous or notorious Colombian drug trafficker who was killed in Medellin, Colombia in 2012. While I was living there, and that experience taught me very conclusively that, you can write, law enforcement can write a press release comparing the wildlife trade to the drug trade, and there may be some minor overlap in some places, but at least my subjects in Stolen World were criminals who shared, to my mind, again, to my subjective mind, the mitigating factor of a genuine interest in natural history, and for that reason, I'll always kind of have a soft spot for them. So let's see. In 2012, after Stolen World came out, I moved to Medellin. And my idea was that I could do more wildlife and nature reporting from Central and South America. And my husband wanted to write crime and security stories because that's what he does. So it was this sort of joint effort to pick up and go and learn Spanish and see what we could achieve. The first piece you'll see up there is it came out last year for the New Yorker magazine, and it was on the Darien Gap, and that's the roadless large rainforest region between Panama and Colombia. It spans the two countries. And they call it the Gap, at least nowadays they call it the Gap, because in the 1960s as the Pan American Highway was being built, and it was supposed to run all the way from Alaska to the tip of Argentina. As it was being completed, it was too difficult to build through this section. The ground was too soft, and engineers at that time couldn't really tackle it. So it was left incomplete for a little while, and then in the 1970s, the construction was stopped altogether because the U.S. Department of Agriculture was worried about a cattle disease. That if you built the road, if you built a contiguous road between the Americas, I think it was hoof and mouth disease. I think that was the concern, but it might have been a different disease. Would have a means of spreading into North America and threaten the stock. So the forest was left alone as a sort of buffer zone, and then the UN sort of stepped in and created two big national parks in Colombia and Panama to keep that belt of forest intact. And later the region, and in part because it was without roads, became really dangerous thanks to armed conflict in Colombia, and it remains pretty dangerous today. It's a center of drug smuggling, it's a center of human trafficking, and the national park on the Colombian side is completely closed because FARC guerrillas have mined it. So every so often an animal or even on occasion a person has stepped on a landmine there. So it's this beautiful park, but it's completely closed. Anyway, the Darien is a fascinating and little known ecosystem that once was a magnet for biological researchers. The big institutions like the Smithsonian used to have offices on the Colombian side, but they've shut them down because they feel that it's too risky to have researchers in the region. So one of the editors at the New Yorker, who I've known a long time, had been fascinated with the Darien for a while, and he assigned me this piece with no real goal, just to go, and it was by merit of me already being in Colombia that I went. So I had 5 weeks to go there and report the story and turn in a piece because they had some sort of hole to fill. So, as reporters, we're often under the illusion that, we'll have nothing new to say. That everything about a place or a subject has already been reported, we'd have nothing to add. And there were whole books I found about the Darien Gap, that I consulted, and I'm thinking, God, I was worried that I'd come up empty-handed, but that could not have been farther from the truth. So I visited with a young guy, a Colombian guide who lived in the region. You really have to have a connection to it to be comfortable there. And he had an uncle living there still, and the drug traffickers recognized members of that family and let them pass. And I ended up with him talking to everyone we ran into, indigenous families, drug traffickers even, settlers, park rangers, and I learned some really, really surprising things. I'm just going to show you a couple images of the area so you get a sense of what it is. I mean, as you come across this coastline, it looks almost unchanged from when the Spaniards discovered it. It's so little altered. I hope it stays that way. And that's a general sense of the forest cover. Well, anyway, so among the surprising things I learned, the first thing I learned that was interesting to me was that 10 years of armed conflict in that region had probably had a mostly, and I'm not going to say entirely, but mostly protective effect on that ecosystem. And in the national park, the tree cover, as you can kind of see, was really healthy because guerrillas had used it to hide. And a few Colombian scientists had braved the place, especially young folks, to do animal surveys, and they were finding very strong, very robust populations of some endangered species. And this was interesting to me because in other places, especially in Central and South America, drug trafficking has had a really negative effect on protected lands. In other parks in Colombia, paramilitaries have chopped down trees, sold the wood to support their operations. made landing strips for drug planes, or converted massive tracts of forest to cattle grazing or ranches as a means of money laundering. So I think when we talk about drug trafficking and its effect on the environment, which is really kind of a hot topic right now, a lot's been written about it, we have to do so on a case-by-case basis. The other weird thing I learned was that the community I visited in the Darien was part of a carbon credits program. So these programs work when a polluting company pays another company to try and compensate for its pollution by, paying a remote community not to cut down its trees. What could possibly go wrong? So in this community that I visited, a program had created a massive social conflict. So technically, according to the Constitution, Afro-Colombian residents were the historic owners of the other underlying land, as it should be. But there were also other longtime residents as well who'd come over the last 20 or 30 years and had families there. And there was a ton of intermarriage in this community, and it was pretty harmonious until the carbon credits program rewarded certain families and not others, and that caused this incredible resentment and division that people were sort of talking my ear off about when I got there. And then I also noticed, and I wish I had a picture to show you of the extent of it, because we were looking here at a really pretty patch of forest, but along the coast you could see the extent of the illegal logging, because the trees would be cut, they'd wash out, and then they'd wash back onto shore. And that's actually the most conspicuous thing as you pull up onto the shore, the sheer amount of cut logs. So, and this was the carbon credits program. So, it couldn't have been really monitored. And if you're in the business of selling carbon credits, and you discover that there's illegal mining in one of your communities, is it really in your interest, to do anything about it? And then on top of that, this was a community that made its money largely from drug smuggling, so not really people you want to mess with in general. There was no authority there really besides organized drug traffickers. There were no police, there was no army presence. So this was my first close-up look at, and I didn't write about it because I didn't feel I had the authority to write about it. I'm just telling you about it. This was my first close-up look at the reality of carbon credits in a remote Colombian rainforest, and I thought it was pretty ugly. So I don't know how other programs are run, and I don't want to impugn any carbon credit program, but this one really gave me pause. Meanwhile, just in the same community, the same rainforest community, just a couple miles away, the United Nations had sponsored a program to build these little, really nice little tourist cabins. And this was under a UN program to increase ecotourism in areas affected by narco-trafficking, right? In theory as an alternative to drug smuggling. So, right. So, standing right by the cabins, which were empty, I might add, not that I even need to add that, were traffickers, were big thugs with walkie-talkies who were armed. And they use the same forest trails to move product, and they'll stop you as though they were or are the regional authority and demand to know who you are and what you're doing, as though they were police. And so a naive tourist, if you can imagine, walking into this situation, the danger they could have been. So that's another, not to sound so contrarian, but I came to question then and there whether ecotourism, which is constantly touted as, the panacea for every, environmentally sensitive place or in the third world, is really always ideal for every community. So anyway, so here I am thinking I would get nothing. This was an amazing amount of information. And there was more too. I mean, I encountered illegal gold mining, all kinds of stuff, human traffickers. Had a long conversation over a beer with a drug trafficker. And this was all from a trip of 2 weeks. So you can talk about all these issues, drug trafficking, carbon credits, ecotourism, all of it. But it's a really different thing to see all these dynamics play out in a little patch of forest all at once, So Woody Allen once said that 80% of life is showing up, but I am convinced that with this type of journalism it's about 95%, because you can't get this stuff on the internet. You just can't. It all really comes through being out there, through being in the field, and you have to be confident. Every reporter, every writer, every investigator has to be confident that what you discover will be new and worth writing about. you know, because it almost always is. So, go on to my next misadventure. Okay. This year, I wrote a piece for a conservation magazine. It's kind of new. It's called The Tortoise. About the murder of a young Costa Rican man named Jairo Mora. He was 26 years old, an environmentalist who was working with leatherback sea turtles on a part of the, I don't know if maybe you've been there, the Costa Rican city of Limón, which is right on the Caribbean side of the country. It's close to Tortuguero, which is a famous turtle beach, but it's a little further south. So Jairo was employed by an international conservation group called Widecast. I'm not sure if it's a Florida group, but they conduct a lot of sea turtle research in Costa Rica. And he was killed by poachers who dig up sea turtle nests and sell the eggs illegally as snacks. You know, and it's extremely common in that part of the Caribbean coast. It's illegal, but it's really common. So Jairo's murder, I really wanted to write this story, even though it had already been covered. It had been covered by Andrew Revkin in the New York Times and his .earth blog. It had been covered by the Costa Rican press extensively. It had been covered by Outside magazine. You know, I was late to the table, but I really wanted to do it. So I tried to find my own angle on it, and I tried to ask as fresh a set of questions as I could come up with. So, you know, the questions I wanted to explore were what were the historical and cultural factors at play, you know, that led to the murder of this young man. And then secondly, had anything changed in that region since Jairo was killed? So I traveled to the beach where he died and stayed with a friend of his who'd worked with him extensively on these leatherback surveys. She was trying her best to keep the nesting surveys going, but now she was receiving death threats, and her young son, you know, was being intimidated at school. So she eventually took up and left the region. But I also researched, even before arriving, the history of the Limón region, which has historically been an extremely, extremely heavy consumer of sea turtle eggs and meat. And digging through some old scientific papers by Archie Carr, who I think needs no introduction, right, around here, I learned that egg poaching had been epidemic in this area, even in the 1950s, and that no scientist had really been able to take hold there as a result of that. Archie Carr had tried to study leatherback nests, but he was the first to notice that there were major nesting populations of this species in the region. But he found that he couldn't get anything done because of the poachers. And then a couple years later, another famous sea turtle scientist, Maria Teresa Coburg, tried to set up in the same region, and thugs burned her hut down. And so anyway, it was left unstudied for a very long time, you know. And at least in Carr's day in the 1950s and 60s, the poachers did not carry weapons. But nowadays, Limón forms part of a drug passage that begins sort of on the Caribbean coast of Colombia and goes all the way north to Mexico. So you have drug movement and you have violence, you know, the accompanying violence in addition to this tradition, really stubborn tradition of eating marine turtle eggs and even meat, you know. And so many of the egg poachers operating on these beaches were also marginally involved in the drug trade. So they would actually shoot at the conservationists in the dark as they were working, and the conservationists were always begging the police to escort them on the beaches, or at least to follow them in their cars, and sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. So going around Limón with that friend of Jairo's, you know, I found illegal turtle eggs being consumed openly everywhere by every type of person. I'd been told that this was an Afro-Caribbean tradition, that it was an aphrodisiac, that whatever. I've been told a lot of things about turtle eggs. These were consumed by men and women of every age, race, social class. You know, it was the bar snack of the region. I actually tasted one, breaking the law, I guess, but I wanted to understand why they were so popular, and I still don't get it. But so anyway, at the end of that night that we were in the bars looking for eggs, we caught 2 Limón police officers, you know, who are well aware that this is illegal, buying eggs from a vendor. So that was really eye-opening. And it gave a really, really good sense of what Jairo had been up against. He just really had no allies in Limon. This is an image that was, stenciled of him on walls all around Costa Rica after he died. But this is an image, if you can see, he's really handsome. This was an image of him, in life, working for Widecast in Limon. So, and there were other factors really working against this kid, including there was a massive shipping port being built. It's being scheduled to be built in Limon. It's this huge, multi-billion-dollar effort. And port officials really didn't want to find a lot of endangered species on that beach. And they'd even sponsored studies saying that there wasn't marine turtle activity on that beach when there were some years, as many as 1,500 leatherback nests. And the study that Jairo was doing was really starting to show that. I'm not trying to say this to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but what I do think is possible is that the police became less committed to helping the conservationists, probably because of pressure from the port. So Jairo and his crew of volunteers ended up alone and vulnerable, and in May of 2013, he was jumped by a group of egg poachers, and he was beaten and dragged behind a car until he was dead, and it was a really shocking crime. International organizations generated a lot of outrage. He was named a hero of the planet by Disney. A ship was named after him. A national park in Costa Rica was renamed for him. But in Limon, no one cared. No one cared. People resented the attention of the Jairo case. There were 7 or 8 suspects involved in the murder, and I don't think the Limon police would have even made any arrests. They had to send, the Costa Rican national government had to send a special team of investigators up to the capital. So, and the saddest part of all, there's no longer any marine turtle conservation work happening there. It's been deemed too dangerous. Widecast pulled out. There are no volunteers going. So this is really scandalous stuff when you think about it, because a lot of the draw and the romance of Costa Rica as a destination has to do with its reputation for environmentalism. And, the reality on the ground can be a lot more complicated. So I left that town with very little hope that anything would change, though this week the poachers are on trial for the murder. So it's like 7 of them. So I'm really eagerly awaiting that judgment, and I hope it's widely reported, and I hope if they're guilty, they're convicted. So we'll see what happens. So I'll talk about a little work that's ongoing. I'm working on a couple other stories, some with some recurrent themes. One is about a Honduran bird scientist who's surveying in a really bad drug region on the Caribbean coast. I don't know why I can't stay away from this, but I don't think it's me. I think it's the region. If you look for wildlife in this region, you may encounter the drug trade. So this is a recurrent theme that I do like. How do you do science in the face of drug trafficking and violence? And I'll tell you, I have found a lot of people willing to do it, and most often they are young people, sometimes undergraduates filling this gap, and some of them without formal science degrees, like Jairo in Costa Rica. He was working toward one, but he didn't have it yet. I'm also working on a story, really interesting story in the Dominican Republic. There's no violence or drugs or mayhem in this story, thank God, but two young Dominican researchers, sort of best buddies, who are looking for a toad that's been lost to science for 40 years. Now that's not that uncommon, that a frog or toad species would sort of go unseen, because you have to really be looking for them. But this wasn't for lack of effort in this case. This truff frog had been actively hunted in the 90s and beyond. It was first collected in 1971, I think, from I'll show you the frog. This is all that exists of it. Really, is a drawing, and those 2 little dots on the map are its sole known localities. So it was collected in the 70s by a biologist from Miami and then never seen. So we don't know if we're going to find this toad alive. I mean, we've been on many trips without success, and if not, the question is what killed it. There's a lot of potential culprits. Climate change, a fungus that's killing frogs in part thanks to, rising temperatures, or ironically enough, and this is a really weird possibility, remote but not impossible. It could be that the scientist who collected the original specimens collected too many. I think he took something like 80. males in a tiny, tiny region. So this species may have been really, really restricted already. And that level of collection might have been just enough, because they reported in their, actually in their somewhat evocative description that they came back to the site for several days subsequent to their first big collecting day, and they never heard the calls again. So it made me wonder, if that was even possible. Anyway, these two guys, the young Dominican guys, they're legitimate field biologists. I feel like I'm getting a little old to be hanging around smugglers and criminals, but they're sort of still scientific outsiders all the same, which I enjoy. I like that. Of the two of them, only one has a college degree. They make their money as birding guides, and they also help foreign scientists, and they collaborate with some pretty top level biologists in the United States. But as for the two of them, they're sort of fueled by, passion, beer, and they've got a really good track record of finding lost species. But a couple months ago, things got a little complicated for them, because in the course of looking for the missing toad, of making one of their, so far 10 survey trips or something, they discovered an altogether new species of toad. And this was not this weird-looking guy. Yeah. So, it's not that uncommon to find, a cryptic species, a species that looks like another species but isn't, and identified that way by DNA. But this thing looks nothing like, the rest of the toads in the genus. And this toad would increase by 25% the number of endemic toads in the Dominican Republic. And yeah, it's actually kind of a big deal, because there are a couple evolutionary biologists in the United States using the relationships between endemic Caribbean species, and not just toads, but also anoles, to lay out larger biogeographical theories about the formation of the islands. So a new species in this toad genus is kind of important once they get the DNA and taxonomy done. So now these guys, who formerly were content to turn everything over to senior scientists, decided that they're hell-bent on describing it themselves. And now they have a few interests lining up against them already. So it's the point that they're having to hide the jars of new specimens in one of them's mom's house because they deposited them in the National Museum in Santo Domingo. Somebody might just knock them off a shelf. I told them the other day, I'm going to the University of Florida. Let me just put it in my bag. I'll deposit it in Gainesville to be safe. They said, no. It's violating every possible law, But at any rate, I visited last week. I was there to check on the habitat of the new toad that they found. So this, to me, adds a little interest to the story. The toad occurs on the southern border with Haiti, this new one. And incredibly, this too looks like it's about to blink out. It looks like it's really a matter of a couple years, because, I'll show you. So there are humongous, this area in the 1940s, 50s, and up to the 60s was mined by Alcoa for bauxite, and that's the main raw material needed for aluminum. And these bauxite mines are extending right into its habitat. They've recently been reopened after years of dormancy to export to China. So anyway, bauxite mining is like taking an ice cream scoop to the earth. Everything's going to die, And the mining companies always have a bit of a spin, They'll plant trees on it afterwards, some sort of pine monoculture or something, and, be content to say, it looks nice, The reality is everything's gone. So, and then, incredibly enough, so here's the habitat of this toad that we know. It's on some karst formations that are covered by forest. So the bauxite mining is coming from here, and then in the other direction you have Haiti, right? And there's a national park. The national park, in theory, could protect the habitat. But as I found a few times, and I'm sure a lot of people who've spent a lot of time in the field understand this very well, national park doesn't always mean that there's no resource extraction taking place. It can often mean that there's tree cutting, there's slashing, there's burning, there's all kinds of things. So the bauxite mining actually extends right up to the gate of the park, and then inside you have squatters, right? And you can see the exposed karst. The toad lives in little puddles, basically, that form in the limestone karst, which creates, it's like Swiss cheese, right? It needs tree cover to maintain that moisture and that habitat for those toads. And the minute you cut it, it's done. You know, there's no way that those puddles can maintain themselves. So yeah, it's a real race against time, you know, and the species hasn't even been described. And there's scientific bickering over the species while it's about of who's to claim the taxonomic victory of the species. While meanwhile, you have, you know, incremental encroaching on the habitat from both directions. So I'm really hoping that my guys can prevail. I don't even have a buyer for this story yet. I do this a lot. I go off and spend my own money on a story without really knowing, you know, if it's going to result in anything. I've actually tried to sell it to Smithsonian. I've done a lot of things, but so far I haven't found a buyer. But I'm just going to keep on it because in the past, sometimes it has worked. With Stolen World, I worked on it for years at my own expense before getting a book proposal together, and I've done some other stories no one's bought. You know, I spent 2 weeks in Ecuador last August following the footsteps of the German explorer Alexander von Humboldt, and we got stuck on a volcano, and it was this whole disaster. And you know, I wrote that, but I still haven't found a buyer. So I still will do this, but I wanted to say to any of the would-be writers and freelance reporters here that, you know, financing this stuff is a bit of a challenge. You almost have to have a separate source of income, you know, if you want to be a freelance reporter. And, you know, the easiest way is to, you know, marry that income. But my husband's a freelance journalist, so it's really unstable. So for a couple of years, I've been doing other things to finance myself. I've been doing online medical reporting, a lot of it, you know, and summarizing research findings, basically. And writing book reviews, which I love. You know, some of them are little 400-word blurby things. Some of them are giant multi-book essays that I basically use just as an excuse to sort of pontificate, you know. And but anyway, I haven't totally lost hope that one day this will all make sense. And that's it. I'd love to take any questions you have. Thanks for coming. Cool. Yeah. It's rough.
Yeah. Right, so I was saying that I'm from El Salvador, and I've heard that you currently living there.
I do.
Could you tell me your experiences as like a reporter in El Salvador? Because like it's a really dangerous country.
Yeah,
so
well,
how do you deal with that?
Okay, so we're in El Salvador more because of my husband. We just sort of looked at a point on the map that seemed central and that I could feasibly get to other countries, including El Salvador. There are some interesting projects going on in El Salvador with marine turtles. There's some avian species that are really, really of interest to me. But yeah, it's really my husband's deal in the sense that he's the one really out there with Salvadoran officials, politicians. You know, he covered the elections there, which were pretty contested, pretty hot. What I have found in El Salvador, you know, besides the danger you can get used to because you change your lifestyle. You know what I mean? You don't walk around certain times. You sort of, you know, you go home at 6 o'clock and that's it. You know, you go from safe place to safe place, and you just get used to it, I think. So I don't feel particularly imperiled, you know, at any time. And we have nice friends there. But one of the things that I do know about reporting from this part of the world is, and I was telling some of the kids in some workshops today that the methods of finding information that work in the United States don't work there. You know, you can't email someone and expect to get a really good response. It's not that everyone doesn't have email; they have it. It's just not. It's not the way to do things. You're going to get blocked a lot. You're going to get hung up on a lot. You're going to have to sit. You're going to have to approach people in person, and also information, in general, is gained from constant personal contact with people. It's almost like intel. You know, so we have this brunch, this journalist brunch that we do every Sunday with some Salvadoran journalists, some Salvadoran cops, actually, you know, what do you call it, an intelligence officer, and an ex-military colonel, and it's fun. You know, we get all the dirt. You know, and then the question is, what do you do with the dirt? And can you prove the dirt? Will anybody else tell you or confirm the dirt? But it's an old-fashioned way to get information. But I was telling kids in the workshop today, like, if you can do this, if you can report there, you know, and you can deal with that type of environment, you can succeed anywhere. So it's great training, you know. I like it. It's fun. Yeah. Yes.
One book.
Yes.
Did you ever find any particular affinity for animal? Did you
Sure.
ever fall in love with the Fiji iguana or?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what'd you fall in love
I
with?
was an animal person before the book. I was, first of all, I was a museum junkie as a kid. I was a member of the American Museum of Natural History in New York when, at the time, it wasn't this, you know, glamorous place with gift shops and stuff. It was kind of dusty. And I had this special privilege membership card, and I could go sit in this dusty room in a big chair with a portrait of Theodore Roosevelt. I liked museums. I always was attracted to. I probably bought my first like Stephen Jay Gould book when I was 11 or 12. So I was always attracted to that world and that aspect of it. And then I did keep a lot of reptile pets. You know, nothing like so expensive, but I really enjoyed them, and I get really itchy when people. With animal rights folks, really itchy, because I find that keeping animals in captivity in some humane and intelligent manner is actually one of the most effective ways to incur, you know, respect and understanding of the natural world, or at least it's an avenue, right? I mean, we were just in the Dominican Republic giving some, you know, basic enviro lectures to folks in the countryside, and those kids, are sort of have an instinct to kill things, or are taught that that's what you do. And a teacher said to us, "You know what is really incredible to us? Seeing these shows with people feeding and even kissing their reptile pets." And I thought, can you really talk about the captive wildlife trade like it's such a bad thing? You know, what's the alternative? You know, you need to cut a snake in half if you see it. So. I'm not saying that those are the only attitudes. Obviously, the politically correct and probably superior attitude is to go on nature walks, let things be, leave things alone, and that's the value that's most promoted now. But I would say, you know, for anyone interested in nature, captive wildlife can be a really rewarding experience. So, did that answer the question? Clefina. Hi, Cynthia. Yeah.
We have this universal challenge.
Mm-hmm.
We have this universal challenge where people love sea turtles already, and
Right.
it's sort of maybe easier to sell a story about a sea turtle to the public and to editors.
Uh-huh.
And the case here might be, you know, it'd be easier to write a story and sell a story about a Florida panther than it would an
Legless
endangered Florida flatwood salamander.
Yeah, right, or legless lizard, or
Right.
yeah.
So what is your advice for journalists who are trying to tell readers why they should care about that frog,
Yeah,
that
okay.
toad that they might not find beautiful?
I probably took a similar approach that you've probably taken, which is, you know, I used to like, because, you know, we had space to fill in the newspaper. I mean, there was always space to fill. And so they would take my little Linnaean pieces, you know, so I would get into species like that, not necessarily knowing their conservation status. In fact, 9 times out of 10, I didn't know, or I just assumed they were common. But, I would just try and take a species that was generally overlooked, like exactly what you're saying, you know, flat-tailed salmon, something like that. And just try and dig and see what science I could dig up, see what papers I could dig up, see who described it, you know, because sometimes someone interesting described it, or there's a story around its description. And I just do these little Sunday little critter features. I got mocked routinely for my little critter stories. But my sense was sort of the way, I like National Geographic a lot, and I like their aesthetic. And one of the things that really thrilled me this month was to see the cover with Carl Zimmer's piece on parasitic bugs. And to me, there was not necessarily a why should we care angle inherent in that, but rather, damn, that's really interesting. And I would say that that's important too, you know. And you know, if a species becomes threatened, yeah, you should care. But otherwise, I think damn, it's interesting is the pathway in. That's my feeling. And I love stories like that. I was so psyched about that, and I was jealous. I wish I could have written it. So, yes.
Wondering, oh, thanks. I was just wondering if your interests ever move into reptiles that are no longer living.
Yeah.
In
fossil.
Gainesville, you know, we have the dubious distinction of having somebody who illegally imported dinosaurs from Mongolia by way of
Great.
UK and so forth. And
The Cope, or the, who was the?
Eric Procopi.
Procopi, okay.
Yeah. And there was a piece in the New Yorker about it, but
Right.
the whole story really hasn't ever been told. And so there's a lot of intrigue there, there are a lot of fossil conventions, and people sell things above the table and under the table in their hotel rooms and so forth. So
Yeah, I
I'm
bet it
wondering
has.
whether your interests ever move in that sort
Well, I
of
was so
direction.
jealous. You know, I get so jealous when other environmental writers do a cool piece. I was so jealous of that Carl Zimmer piece. I get really envious. I got to admit, you know, of other writers. And when I saw that Mongolian fossil piece, I was like, oh, I would have really liked to have done that. So yeah, I do. And then, you know, there have been pieces in books, you know, about a lot of, it's not just necessarily natural history specimens. I find there's some parallels of the art world, and everybody loves a piece about art fraud and art, you know, and you know, black market. I think any black market is fascinating. But yeah, I would have loved to have done that piece that New Yorker writer did. Yeah. Yes.
So when you were talking about the UN idea with the ecotourism to replace drug trafficking,
Yep.
it sounded a lot like, almost like they hadn't even been there. So like,
You're probably
going
right.
to these places, do you sometimes, like, have you gotten any ideas about stuff that should be done that maybe people aren't so much thinking about because they're just off in, you know, other
I mean,
countries?
I think one of the things I think what are the scourges of these parts of the world, right? I find cattle farming to be probably the single most damaging activity in these parts of the tropics. And if anybody can come up with, and sometimes I think people farm cattle or ranch because they might not even be familiar with another time-tested way of making money in those parts of the world. And I think if there were more introduced, you know, if there were more sort of economic. When I say economic alternatives, I'm not talking about radically shifting the economic paradigm from farming to entertaining tourists. I'm talking about shifting from one product to another. You know, I'm sure even pig farming can't be nearly as damaging because you don't have to cut down the trees to do it. There are other things I just learned recently, and I was kind of intrigued by this, that chickens, which I had thought of as sort of a benign part of any rural landscape, you know, and most people don't feed their chickens. You know, in the tropics, they just kind of let them be, and they're out to survive. That they actually eat a lot of, you know, a lot of invertebrate species and a lot of vertebrate species, small vertebrates that are kind of important, like these endemic toads and stuff. So, you know, even unmanaged chicken farming can be really dangerous. So I think that if I had my way, there would be other. Not crops, but other agricultural products introduced in these regions. I think that could make a big difference. If you could just reduce cattle farming, you know, because that is by far the worst. And I really do think it's for lack of, I think just people don't know they don't know what else to do. You know, they know they can make money with cows. So that's what I would attack. I certainly wouldn't, I'm really pretty cynical about programs that are supposed to, like, you know, if you go to Whole Foods and you buy a product and it says, you know, what's so great about this product is it was made by artisan women living in this town, or, you know, it was a product, you know, some artisanal product. I haven't seen grand effects from that sort of thing on the ground, you know, so I tend to be a little dubious. In fact, there was this big program also sponsored by the UN in El Salvador that had it has a great, the purpose is fantastic, the idea is fantastic, and it's had some effects. And if a woman is battered, they can come into this place, and it's not just a shelter, it's legal assistance, you can educate your kids there. It provides like a pretty complete protection. but it trains women who might not have a job in making artisan goods for tourists, which I think, like, you know, how many tourists are there in El Salvador? We've got a State Department travel warning on it, and to read it, it's like a narrative of, you know, why you shouldn't go to El Salvador, which I disagree with, but either way, it's not, you can't expect a large flow of tourism. So I think there's a first world ideal of how third world people should be making money, and I think that needs to be rethought, because I think it can be awfully ineffective. Yeah. Yes, sir. Oh, wow. I have my favorite writers. I try to apply, like, I can tell you who my favorite journalists are. My favorite journalists are John Lee Anderson and Calvin Trillin, the New Yorker guys. I try to emulate that plain-spoken style with my own work. God, as far as science writers, Stephen Jay Gould was my favorite science writer, and probably always will be. I like Richard Forty. You must, obviously. I'm not a big fan of Richard Dawkins at all. I think he's a real sourpuss, and I think he causes more harm than good. You know, and I recently slammed his autobiography in the pages of TLS, and it wasn't because it was a bad book. It wasn't, you know, he phoned it in, but he must have had like a 10-book contract or something. But yeah, I think Forty is really fantastic writer. I eat up everything he writes. And I think I just reviewed the best entomology book ever written. And there's a close second on this, but it's by a Swedish author, a Swedish entomologist, pretty obscure to Americans. He's not obscure in Sweden. The book was a bestseller there. But if you can find this book, I think it's just like a real treasure. It's called The Fly Trap, and it's by an author named Fredrik Sjöberg. I don't know what those umlauts on or the slash, I don't know how to pronounce them. But at any rate, it's a book by an entomologist that gets into something that feels sort of forbidden, which is like, he described almost as like the narcotic pleasure of entomology, and you know why he likened the device by which you suck up an insect from a flower, it's called a pooter, to an opium pipe, and that's what it was, sort of confessional. And he said something really funny, which was that, you know, if everyone asks me what I do and why I do what I do, and if I tell them that I do what I do, I collect these species in order to survey the natural history or mark changes in the local fauna, everyone will understand and applaud what I do. He said, but it's a lie. He said, because pleasure is so awkward. So I really like this contrarian, strange take on the entomological profession. I thought it was just great, like a classic in its own right, outside of the natural history genre. But I'm sure after I leave, I'm sure I'm going to think of 10 more writers. But I love them all. So, yes. Thank you. Oh, I'm so glad. All right. Thanks, guys.